let's just jump right in with something pretty stark. The Doomsday clock. It's now at 90 seconds to midnight.
90 seconds, wow.
Yeah, that's the closest humanity has, well, ever been to global catastrophe. It's quite a chilling reminder of where we stand.
It really is a challenging moment. And our mission today really is to dive deep into why. Why are we here? We're going to unpack these huge existential threats facing humanity. And maybe more importantly, look at the forces, the things often ignored that stop us from actually tackling them.
Right. And we're drawing our insights today from a really compelling new book, A Livable Future is Possible, Confronting the Threats to Our Survival. It's got these fascinating interviews with two incredible minds, Noam Chomsky, the renowned public intellectual, and Robert Pollin, the political economist. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's dive straight into those two major threats that Chomsky and Pollin highlight right off the bat. What are the primary dangers they see?
Well, Chomsky is very, very firm on this. He believes humanity faces two massive intertwined existential threats. Number one, the climate crisis. Number two, nuclear war.
Okay.
And on the climate crisis, he argues it's genuinely unique in human history. And it's getting more severe year by year. He thinks we could hit a point of no return within just decades.
Decades. And he doesn't treat them like separate issues, right? He links the climate danger directly to the danger from weapon systems.
Precisely. He points out that weapon systems are just steadily becoming more dangerous and more ominous.
Yeah.
He reminds us that 70 years ago, thermonuclear weapons showed we could, well, destroy everything.
It feels like this constant background hum of risk.
It does. And you can see just how close things got back in '62, the missile crisis. I mean, many historians call that the most dangerous moment ever. And Chomsky also makes a critical point. He sees the U.S.'s current approach, this rules-based international order and its nuclear posture, as actually increasing global risk right now.
Okay, but despite painting this incredibly grim picture, Chomsky famously has this motto, optimism over despair. How does he square that? How do you reconcile these dire warnings with, hope?
Well, his core belief is that activism is absolutely key to building a better world. His optimism isn't like a passive thing. It's really rooted in this conviction that humanity can steer away from these catastrophes, but only if we take deliberate, organized action.
So it's a call to arms almost.
In a way, yeah. A call to agency even when things look bleak.
Okay, so we have these twin threats. The immediate question then is, why aren't we doing more? Especially in climate. What do Chomsky and Pollin say are the real deep down reasons, the institutional barriers?
Yes. This is where Chomsky brings in what he calls the vile maxim, borrowing the term from Adam Smith. He argues government decisions always end up reflecting where the power lies in society. So the masters of mankind, and he identifies them as the corporate sector, the wealthy elites, they are the principal architects of policy. And their main goal, as Smith saw it, is to make sure their own interests will be most peculiarly attended to.
Even if the effects on everyone else are grievous, as he puts it.
Exactly. Regardless of the wider consequences. It's that all for ourselves and nothing for other people idea Smith wrote about.
The vile maxim. It sounds pretty harsh. So how does this self-interest, this all for ourselves thing, actually show up in climate policy? Can you give an example of how this profit drive plays out, even in things presented as solutions?
Yeah, and that's what Chomsky argues is the core institutional barrier. You see it really clearly, he says, in proposed solutions like carbon capture. The book argues it often just serves as a smokescreen. It's a pretext, Chomsky says, that some remote technological breakthrough will ride to the rescue.
So it lets us keep doing what we're doing.
Exactly. It allows continued fossil fuel burning, delays real action, and crucially, it funnels huge amounts of cash into industry profits. It's essentially subsidizing the problem it claims to solve.
And the funding for this. The book's quite critical of that too, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's often funded by the friendly taxpayer, as Chomsky puts it. And sometimes, believe it or not, the technology is used to extract more oil. He just calls that capitalism 101.
Wow.
And this ties directly into what he describes as the adamant GOP dedication to environmental destruction. He points to the Koch brothers' influence, that juggernaut that really shut down climate initiatives in the Republican Party after 2008.
So it's not just ignorance. It's, a deliberate dynamic driven by profit. It's almost darkly funny, funding something that seems to solve a problem but actually lets you do more of it. But is there a way out economically? This is where Robert Pollin comes in, right? Looking at the actual feasibility of clean energy.
Yes, and Pollin's work is really illuminating here. His key finding is, essentially, that a global clean energy transition getting to net zero by 2050 is entirely realistic.
Realistic. What does that mean in terms of cost?
He estimates it would take about 2.5% of global GDP per year on average. That works out to maybe $4.5 trillion annually by 2050.
That sounds like a lot of money.
It does, until you compare it. Pollin points out that high-income countries pump 10% or more of their country's respective GDPs into COVID bailout operations.
Ah, okay. So perspective.
Exactly. It shows the economic capacities there. It really comes down to political will to priorities.
And Pollin doesn't just frame it as a cost, right? He sees it as an opportunity, too. What about the benefits?
Huge benefits. He stresses that clean energy investments would be a major engine of job creation. We're talking 2 to 3 times more jobs than you get from fossil fuel infrastructure for the same amount of money spent. And, crucially, it delivers cheaper energy in the long run. So this isn't just about saving the planet. It's actually a path to, well, economic revitalization.
Now, a really critical piece of this, Pollin emphasizes, is the idea of a just transition. What does that actually involve, and how does he argue it's even possible?
Right. A just transition is vital. It means ensuring that workers displaced from fossil fuel industries aren't just left behind. It means guaranteed new jobs, comparable pay, making sure their pensions are intact.
That sounds expensive, though. How does he make the case it's feasible?
He uses West Virginia as a case study. There are about 40,000 fossil fuel jobs there. But because of retirements and the gradual nature of the phase-out, only about 1,400 workers per year might actually face displacement.
Okay, so not everyone at once.
Exactly. And the cost to guarantee their livelihoods, things like retraining, relocation assistance, he estimates it at only about $42,000 per worker per year.
$42,000
per worker, yeah, which totals around $143 million a year for the whole state.
Yeah.
Now, that sounds like a chunk, but it's about 0.2% of West Virginia's overall level of economic activity GDP.
0.2%. Wow, that makes it sound incredibly achievable.
It really does. It shows it's not some massive, insurmountable economic burden. It's manageable.
And yet, despite Pollin showing it's economically possible, we see these disappointing setbacks, like the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, at COP26. You had institutions holding $130 trillion pledging support, but now many are backing away.
Yeah, they're abandoning their pledges.
Yeah.
It really drives home those institutional barriers we talked about.
Why? What does the book suggest is happening there?
Well, the book points out that the revived fortunes of fossil fuels, especially coal, may explain some of the weakened resolve.
So profit again.
It seems so. A pretty stark example of how that vile maxim can undercut even these big public commitments when the financial winds shift.
Okay, so Pollin provides this economic roadmap showing a livable future is possible, financially anyway. But these aren't just national issues, are they? The book then kind of zooms out, looking at global dynamics, ecosystems, power shifts, even population. Where do they take that global view first?
They start with a really critical ecosystem, the Amazon rainforest. Everyone knows how important it is ecologically. It's largely self-sustaining. But if it gets damaged too much, it could tip over into irreversible decline.
Which would be catastrophic.
Globally catastrophic, yeah. And the authors detail how, during Bolsonaro's presidency in Brazil, deforestation across Brazil soared. We're talking over 800 million trees destroyed, mostly for beef export.
Just staggering. And dangerous work trying to stop it.
Tragically, yes. Indigenous experts, journalists like Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips, people working to protect the forest, were actually murdered. Now, Brazilian ecologists are really trying to support indigenous communities, recognizing them as the true guardians.
It's easy to feel pretty overwhelmed by that scale of destruction, but the book does point to some positive signs too, right? Where is real progress happening on renewables?
Yeah, there are definitely bright spots, and China is a major one. The book notes China is far in the lead globally when it comes to making clean energy stuff, batteries, solar panels, you name it.
Really? Ahead of everyone else?
By a long shot, according to the authors. And they're on track to peak their emissions before 2030 and hit net zero by 2060.
That's significant.
Really?
But the book mentions some complexities there, too, regarding how China is perceived.
Yes. They talk about what they call newspeak in U.S. media. Things like misrepresenting China's emissions by focusing on total numbers instead of per capita, which paints a different picture. And they also point to U.S. efforts to contain China's innovations, like restricting access to advanced computer chips.
And on the bigger picture, globally, the book touches on population. What's Chomsky's take on that? Is population reduction part of the solution, and how?
Chomsky does say that global population should be reduced, perhaps considerably. But his method for achieving that humanely is the education of women.
Education of women. How does that work?
Well, it's been shown, he argues, to lead to sharp population reduction in both rich countries and poor. And he stresses this needs to go hand in hand with basic human rights, like those in the 1948 Universal Declaration. Things like ensuring motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance.
Right. So not coercive measures, but empowerment.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears then. Moving from the climate crisis to that other huge threat, nuclear war. How do these same institutional problems and global shifts play out when it comes to nuclear risk?
Well, Chomsky makes a really crucial distinction here. He talks about the difference between the established UN system and what the U.S. calls the rules-based international order.
Okay, what's the difference in his view?
He argues the U.S. and its allies tend to reject the UN system, which is based on the UN Charter, explicitly banning the threat or use of force. Instead, they favor this rules-based system where, effectively, the hegemonic power, meaning the U.S., gets to set the rules and also decide when to ignore them or change them.
Can you give some examples of how that plays out, this difference between the UN Charter and the rules-based approach?
The book gives several examples, things like the U.S. imposing third-party sanctions, basically telling other countries they have to comply, like the sanctions designed to strangle Cuba, actions that almost the entire world opposes at the UN but are enforced anyway. And ignoring international legal rulings, like World Court decisions against freezing Iranian assets, or even when the U.S. just withdrew from the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction altogether back in 1986, after it was condemned for its terrorist war against Nicaragua. The authors even mentioned the U.S. arguing it was exempt from the treaty banning genocide.
Wow. And how does the U.S. nuclear posture fit into this rules-based picture, especially since the mid-90s?
According to the book, it's become far more extreme. They quote Admiral Charles Richard, who was head of STRATCOM, the U.S. Strategic Command.
What did he say?
He explicitly stated that nuclear weapons provide maneuver space for the U.S. to carry out conventional military operations. Basically, they deter all countries all the time from interfering with whatever the U.S. wants to do.
That sounds incredibly risky.
It does. Stephen Young from the Union of Concerned Scientists is quoted calling the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review a terrifying document. It really highlights that increased risk.
Now, the Ukraine war is obviously a devastating conflict. What broader points do Chomsky and Pollin make about it in terms of nuclear risk and these geopolitical tensions?
Well, first, they are absolutely clear the invasion itself is a criminal act of aggression. No ambiguity there.
Okay.
But Chomsky also argues it was deliberately provoked by NATO expanding eastward despite warnings. He quotes William Burns, the former U.S. ambassador, now CIA director, who warned back in 2008 that bringing Ukraine into NATO was the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite.
And what about the U.S. policy during the war? What do the authors say about that?
They point to the official U.S. policy goal, which is stated as fighting the war to severely weaken Russia. The implication, they argue, is that this pretty much rules out a diplomatic settlement.
And how is that seen elsewhere?
Well, the authors contend that much of the world outside of what they call the Europe Anglosphere sees it as a proxy war being fought to the last Ukrainian.
One of the most shocking parts of the book relates to the Nord Stream pipelines, the sabotage. How do the authors approach that? What conclusion do they lean towards?
They look at the evidence available and state what they see as the obvious conclusion, that the most likely culprit was the U.S. They argue the U.S. had both motive and capability. And they point directly to President Biden's public statement before the invasion, where he said, regarding Nord Stream 2, if Russia invaded Ukraine, we will bring an end to it.
And how was that event covered?
That's another key point for them. They note how the whole incident was quickly dispatched to obscurity in most Western media. They find that silence quite telling.
It really sounds like they're describing a major shift happening in global power dynamics, with media narratives playing a big role. How do they characterize this global realignment?
They actually make an interesting comparison. They suggest that back in the 1970s, Soviet Union, despite heavy censorship, ordinary Russians might have actually been better informed than Americans.
Yeah.
Because they actively sought out alternative news sources like BBC or Voice of America.
And now
they point to things like a Pew poll showing climate change way down the list of concerns for U.S. voters and nuclear war not even registering. They see this alongside countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, moving away from Washington's orbit. This shift towards a multipolar world, they conclude, is something deeply unwelcome, anathema to the U.S.
Okay, so we have these massive external threats, shifting global power. But this raises a crucial question. What's going on inside our societies? What makes us so vulnerable to all this?
Yeah, that's a huge part of their analysis. A major factor they point to is the legacy of what they call neoliberal policies.
Neoliberalism, what have been the consequences, according to them?
Radical inequality, primarily. They cite a Rand Corporation study estimating that almost $50 trillion, that's trillion with a T in wealth, was effectively transferred from workers and the middle class to the top 1% during those neoliberal decades.
50 trillion, that's hard to even comprehend.
It is. They illustrated by saying the top 1% share of income went from around 9 or 10% back on the 40s through the 70s, up to 25% since 1980.
Wow. But it wasn't just about money shifting, was it? How did neoliberalism weaken society's ability to push back, making people, as you said, easy prey for demagogues?
Right. They argue it involved a systematic attack on the defenses ordinary people had. Unions, for instance. Leaders like Reagan and Thatcher opened the door to corporate attacks on unions, weakening worker power.
And education.
Public education was another major target. Sharp defunding, pushing teaching to test models that undermine critical thinking and inquiry. The result. By 2021, teachers faced a record 23.5% wage penalty compared to similar professionals. And between early 2020 and mid-2022, 300,000 public school educators just left the field.
300,000?
Yeah. The authors argue this whole process helped create a population that was more passive, obedient, and atomized.
The book also talks about the crisis of democracy, but redefines it. How do they see that crisis differently from the usual understanding?
It's fascinating. They go back to a Trilateral Commission report from the 1970s. That report saw the crisis not as too little democracy, but actually too much democracy.
Too much? Seriously?
Yes, stemming from the activism of the 1960s, young people, women, workers demanding more rights. The commission was worried about, quote, the failure of the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, meaning schools and universities weren't keeping people in line enough.
That's a very different take on a crisis of democracy.
It really is. And they contrast that with the Powell Memorandum from the same era, which was a much more aggressive call for businesses to basically go to war to defend the American economic system from what it saw as a broad attack.
And how has this played out more recently, specifically with the Republican Party? How do the authors describe its transformation?
They argue the contemporary Republican Party has fundamentally changed, that it's abandoned its past role as an authentic parliamentary party. They use descriptions like a radical insurgency, drawing on analysts Mann and Ornstein. Edward Luce called it nihilistic, dangerous, and contemptible, a view the book notes was endorsed by a former CIA director, Michael Hayden.
Strong words. And what do they see as the goal of this transformed party and its methods?
The goal, they argue, is essentially permanent political control, even as a minority party. They term it Orban-style illiberal democracy, referencing Hungary's leader.
Examples.
Things like Trump's reported plans to replace the nonpartisan civil service with loyalists, or efforts to prevent the teaching of accurate American history. And the method often involves using intense culture wars.
Culture wars is a distraction.
Exactly. Things like playing on white supremacy, Christian nationalism, the anti-abortion movement, attacks on public education, even QAnon conspiracies about grooming or the Great Replacement. This is all designed to divert attention from policies that actually harm their base economically, policies that rob you blind and destroy all your support systems. They even point to Justice Alito's reasoning on overturning Roe v. Wade, citing historical tradition as part of this pattern.
And this links to denialism, too.
Yes, rampant denialism, they say, especially denying the 2020 election results, which a majority of Republican nominees apparently did. They call this denialism a disease that is spreading through our political process, something that fundamentally threatens the legitimacy of elections themselves.
This all leads to a really profound, almost philosophical question they raise at the end, doesn't it? About maybe entering an anti-Enlightenment era. What's the ultimate challenge they leave us with?
Yeah, it gets quite deep. The ultimate question they pose is whether humans can close the gap between their technological capacity to destroy and their moral capacity to control this impulse.
Can our morality catch up with our technology?
Basically, yes. And they give these examples that are just grimly absurd, satire incarnated, they call it, like ConocoPhillips installing chillers into thawing Arctic permafrost. Why? To keep it solid enough to drill for oil. The very oil whose burning is causing the permafrost to melt in the first place.
Wow, that perfectly captures the disconnect, doesn't it?
It's a really stark illustration of that moral gap they're talking.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, navigating the really complex picture Chomsky and Pollin paint. These huge existential threats, climate, nuclear war made worse by these institutional failures, by a democratic social order that feels like it's fraying at the edges, leaving us vulnerable.
It is a lot to absorb, but Chomsky does offer one final, really provocative thought that sort of underlies everything we've discussed. He says essentially, the game is not over unless we choose to end it.
Meaning, there's still a choice.
Yes. He challenges us, really. He asks us to consider whether our human moral intelligence can actually rise to the challenge, whether we can find the capacity to control these incredibly destructive impulses we have.
That is a powerful note to end on, a call to reflection. What does this mean for your own understanding of the world? And maybe, what does it mean for potential action? It really makes you think about the structures shaping our world and the power we might have if we act together.